welcome everybody. Welcome everybody to our guest lecture this evening with Silke Zoller. I'm Bernhard Blumenau. I'm a lecturer at the CSCPV, and I'll be chairing this event today. Before I'll let Silke give her presentation, just a couple of things on general housekeeping. If I could ask you, as I think everybody has done already, to just mute yourselves and turn the cameras off, that would be great. Also, for the discussion later on, Silke will be talking for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have a Q&A session with the audience. There are two options for you to participate. One is to just type your question into the chat and then just post that, and I'll be reading that out. The other one is to raise your hands, and then I'll be calling upon you, in which case then please unmute yourself. If you want to, you can turn the camera on as well. Ask your question, and afterwards please lower your hand so that we know who still has questions to ask, and also mute yourself again and turn the camera off again. Okay, I think we're at 17:31, so it's time to start. I think we are both ready. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Silke Zoller. Dr. Zoller is assistant professor of history at Kennesaw State University. She received her Ph.D. from Temple University, where she worked under Richard Immerman. She has a master from Eberhard Karls University in Tübingen, and also a bachelor from Tübingen. Before moving to Kennesaw State University, she was working as a postdoctoral fellow at the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin, and before that at the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College. Among her many publications, there's one that's standing out a lot, which is this one, unfortunately, they're showing, To Deter and Punish Global Collaboration Against Terrorism in the 1970s. It's the basis of her talk today as well, and I believe it's also the result in many ways of her PhD studies. I think that's it, so I don't want to take up more time, and I'm happy to hand over to Silke now for her presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Bernhard, for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you to the center for hosting me. I'm just going to bring up my PowerPoint very quickly and hope that it works. All right, so thank you again. So I'm a historian, and I come to the topic of terrorism as a historian. So in the discipline of history, overall, there are very few studies on terrorism and counterterrorism, especially when compared to related fields such as political science and international relations. Some of this brevity is because of the way that historians work, with a focus on archival research. Sources on terrorism and counterterrorism tend to be classified, and they tend to be tricky to access, especially for the recent past, and especially if they're government sources. Another issue lies in the term terrorism. Historians are very aware that this is a politicized term that changes over time. But historians can and do research a lot of related subjects, like guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency, and the wars of decolonization, or urban unrest and rioting. And we've seen, especially in the past 15 years, really start to see historians publish strong research about terrorism and counterterrorism and connect their research to the work that is already being done. So what they're doing is using terrorism and counterterrorism as central categories of analysis to think about violence, state authority, and legitimacy in the past. So my book fits into and builds upon this body of historical research. And by making terrorism a central category of analysis, my research shows the long historical roots of US and European international collaboration against border-crossing irregular violent actors. So the book focuses on the decade of the 1970s. And I look at this decade as a specific transitional moment in the history of terrorism and of counterterrorism. So in this decade, what we see is a transition from the era of decolonization, from the time of the global protest movements of the 1960s into the 1980s and onward, when terrorism becomes an established threat that Western governments operate against, as seen by policies in the United States and Europe, policies that would set the early stage for the later global war on terror. So I show how in the 1970s, US and European officials started to think of terrorism as an international threat and as a non-state threat. And I trace how they collaborated to undercut the violent actors that they called terrorists, as well as the state supporters of such actors, what we would today call rogue states, and related ideology that they used. So this practice begins in the 1970s, and it includes several historical developments that were quite specific to that decade and influenced by this time, including the spread of globalization, the rise of law and order policies against the dissident movements of the 1960s. So these are two things. So just a quick roadmap. In this talk, I will present the central argument of my book. And then I will discuss how and why in the 70s the US and Western European states began to address international terrorism together. And I trace why they chose to address it specifically as a criminal issue and as a law enforcement issue. And I will then showcase my research with a case study, a chapter from my book which covers the 1972 Munich Olympic Games attack. So the book focuses on terrorism and on counterterrorism in the long, what I call the long 1970s, so from 1968 into the early 1980s. So why the 1970s? Why this decade? Let me provide some context on what is going on right now. At that moment in time, the term terrorism had been in use as a political concept for almost 200 years. A range of historical actors had deployed it in different eras and in different places to describe certain forms of violence. So before the 70s, in the 50s and 60s, European and American officials used the term terrorism mainly to describe violence that was used by insurgents or states against civilian populations. And the important thing was that this usually happened in colonial and post-colonial spaces. The insurgents were usually fighting against a colonial regime, so they saw themselves as anti-colonial revolutionaries. So the locations where you would find people labeled terrorists in the 50s and 60s are in areas that were previously colonized. Most of these areas are in what we today refer to as the Global South. So what changes moving into the 70s? From 1968 onward, we see the advent of new forms of violent attacks against civilians. These are attacks by self-proclaimed anti-colonial insurgents, who are often calling themselves national liberation actors. And leading the way are extremist Palestinians. Their goal is to attack Israeli targets outside of Israel and also to hit the citizens, the territory, and the property of states that are allied with Israel. So what they want to do is draw attention to what they call their national liberation struggle, and also to showcase their power to act on the international stage. And after 1968, extremist Palestinians exported what they saw as their anti-colonial violence from their contested area, which is Israel, into the former colonial metropoles, the industrialized states of the global north. At first through hijackings and mail bombs, and later we see attacks such as embassy takeovers and bombings. And these attacks are at times large in scale. They affect a lot of people at once, and they have significant international components. They affect citizens from many states, including global north states, and these attacks take place in spaces that have previously not been strongly affected by decolonizing violence. So these attacks affect, for example, airplane travel. The picture you see here is of the 1970 Dawson's Field hijackings, where hundreds of passengers were held hostage. The attacks also hit in Europe, so in areas that were usually colonizer and not colonized. And because of the scale and the international dimensions of these attacks, they are reported on widely in media throughout the world. Alongside the Dawson's Field hijackings, some examples that we have is the Munich Olympic Games attack in 1972, the Entebbe hijacking in 1976, and a number of embassy takeovers, including in The Hague in 1974, in Stockholm, in Tehran, and in London. So I discuss these examples throughout my manuscript. And in the United States and in Western Europe, the media frames these attacks as a new security threat, one that can hit civilians at any time at home or really anywhere. So overall, in the 70s, processes of globalization bring people, goods, and ideas into ever-increasing contact with one another. And this globalization also includes the spread of extremist Palestinian attacks and similar attacks. So that's the context of what is happening in the late 60s and early 70s. And so in this context, I analyze how state officials begin to reach out to one another across national borders to think about this threat. So my research looks at state officials in the United States and in Western Europe, and it analyzes their collaboration against international terrorism in the 1970s. So US and European officials, Germans, British officials, French officials, and others realize that these attacks have international dimensions. And so they're looking to see whether they can set up international state responses. And so I argue that the 1970s marked the beginning of modern counterterrorism collaboration amongst the United States and Europe. Oh, a second, I need to go back. There. So my book emphasizes, and this is getting closer to the main thesis, that the US and European states pursue a very distinct and specific strategy when collaborating against international terrorism. So what they're attempting to do is turn terrorism and counterterrorism into crime-focused issues. They want to focus on the attack itself and the criminal nature of the attack and ignore or downplay the political context, the military context, contexts that often have to do with decolonization. And what US and European officials are doing is seeking regional and global agreements. These agreements require all states to commit to passing criminal laws against attacks such as hijacking, for example. States have to commit to enforcing these laws, and if the state that signs up onto this agreement also has to commit to the idea that they would be willing to extradite attackers. These agreements are actually framed as extradition agreements, because who is extraditable? A criminal. So the judicial concept that these officials use is called audedere audjudicare, which translates to extradite or to prosecute. The idea is that if authorities in one state arrest someone who is suspected of committing an attack abroad or who has committed an attack with international dimensions, then that arresting state needs to either extradite the attacker to another state for criminal prosecution, and if the arresting state does not do so, then its authorities need to prosecute the attacker using their own domestic criminal laws. So the idea is, if you've signed on to this agreement, that state authorities cannot just let the suspect go. Many extradition agreements also have protections for politically motivated actors. The idea is that a state does not have to extradite a person to a place where they would be punished for acting on their political beliefs. So, for example, the US does not have to return a political dissident to the Soviet Union, even if the Soviets claim that the dissident committed a crime according to Soviet laws. And so what Western states are also trying to do with these extradition agreements against terrorism, they're trying to word them in ways that get rid of any protections for politically motivated actors in terrorism cases. The hope is that terrorism attackers will always be treated as ordinary criminals. So overall, thus, if you sign on to one of these extradition agreements, states thus need to pass domestic criminal laws against terroristic acts. They have to arrest terrorist suspects, and then they have to either extradite the suspect or prosecute them domestically. So the ultimate goal that US and European bureaucrats are pursuing here is to close off safe havens for attackers and deny them political support from other states. The idea is to ensure that no matter where attackers hit and where they flee, they will always be prosecuted for their crimes and hopefully extradited to the state where they attacked to face the judicial system there. So the idea is to deter attackers before they commit attacks and to be able to punish those who do commit attacks. So to deter and punish is the goal. So overall, the US and European strategy is to handle international terrorism as a crime and law enforcement issue, and to push other states to commit to criminal laws and enforcement, thus hopefully quickly resolving what officials see as a new and rather urgent security threat. This approach also fits into many Western states' law and order initiatives in the 1970s. So whether these initiatives are called law and order, as in the US, or internal security in Germany, these initiatives are ways to police the population, to police the dissident movement of the 1960s. And so we can see the terrorism efforts sort of as ways to police the spreading globalization of this era by making crime a more international thing that people are collaborating on, that officials are collaborating on. However, this US and European strategy is highly controversial in the 70s as well, especially in global institutions such as the United Nations. The attackers see themselves as revolutionaries, they see themselves as national liberation fighters, and as anti-colonial guerrillas. So the people committing these attacks see themselves as politically motivated actors, which is the kind of actor that has traditionally been protected from extradition. And since World War II, over 60 countries had gained their independence, mainly in the global South. The attackers I discuss are framing their violence in this context. The best example is, again, Palestinian extremists. So what the attackers argue is that what they're doing is exporting their national liberation struggle to states that are helping to suppress this national liberation struggle, including any allies of Israel, including the former colonizers in Europe, including the hegemonic United States. Overall, state officials around the world almost universally condemn these large-scale terrorist attacks and the brutal violence that is committed against civilians in these attacks. This sort of violence does violate criminal laws and provisions against harming civilians in the laws of war. But many of these states that are recently independent have anti-colonial struggles in their immediate history. The best examples are Algeria and Cuba. So the officials in these states used to be national liberation actors themselves. And so while these officials condemn the brutality of the attacks, they argue that the international community can only prevent future attacks by addressing the underlying political context. Contexts such as, for example, the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so they don't want just a criminal approach, they want a political approach as one that is going to be more effective. And in addition to that, officials from states like Algeria and Cuba argue that the US and European approach is really dangerous because it requires states to arrest and prosecute violent actors without consideration of political context. So they're worried that this approach could be used in the future against all sorts of people who commit violence in the name of national liberation movements, because these extradition agreements disregard, or at least are trying to disregard, protections for political actors. So officials from many Arab states, from many African states, argue that this is a new form of counterinsurgency, and that these law enforcement measures are actually deeply political and can be used to repress revolutionary actors or political dissidents without consideration of military or political context. So overall, international agreements against terrorism are highly controversial because they are actually discussions about the future of decolonization, the future of self-determination, and about national liberation. What is a rational anti-colonial struggle? What is rational anti-colonial warfare? Are these illegitimate attacks? Who deserves to be protected as a politically motivated actor? These are all questions that are being raised in the discussion around terrorism. I should clarify that no matter what, all of these terrorist attacks break laws and are criminal. But the discussion in the 70s is about how to address such violence moving forward. So overall, the US and Europeans are able to pass 8 international extradition agreements in the 1970s. These are rather weakly worded, and it's really hard to enforce them. And the US and Europeans have their own domestic anti-terrorism approaches as well. What I argue, though, is that these international extradition agreements are created, and what they do is establish a normative Western, that is US and European, approach to terrorism. And this includes a conception of terrorism as an individual act, as a non-state act, as an illegitimate act, and as a criminal offense. There's no buy-in from the entire global community. Again, this is a Western normative understanding. And so from the outset of modern US and European collaboration, we have a tension running through counterterrorism practices and policies. On the one hand, officials claim that terrorists are individuals and criminals, and they pursue these extradition agreements to prosecute and extradite them. But on the other hand, there is in fact a political and militarized context, the context of revolution, decolonization, insurgency, and counterinsurgency. And there is the question of whether terrorists should be considered politically motivated actors for the purpose of extradition. So a lot of the relatively new and young states in the world say, yes, terrorists should be politically motivated actors. The Western states mostly say, no, these are not politically motivated actors. And to tell this story, I use sources from government and private archives in the United States, Germany, and Great Britain. I mostly use government archives, including from the US State Department, the records of the West German Foreign Office, the West German Interior Ministry and Justice Ministry, and the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Home Office. The records of these agencies also include correspondence with most other European states. I also include media publications and the records of terrorism specialists at the Hoover Institution in California. So that was sort of a big picture overview of the argument of the book. Now moving from the general to the specific, in the next section, I would like to look at a case study, the second chapter of the book. So this chapter takes us to 1972, to the Munich Olympic Games attack, and to subsequent debates in the United Nations. The chapter highlights in more detail how the United States and its Western European allies sought to address international terrorism as a crime and law enforcement issue. And it also shows the debates which ensued over decolonization and national liberation. So this case shows really well that the Western conception of terrorism as an extraditable crime and nothing else is really not self-evident at the time. We think of it as self-evident. Of course, it's a horrible crime. That's what it is. But it's not necessarily so straightforward in the 70s. So once again, a little bit of context. By 1972, the United States, Europe, and the global North in general have already experienced several years' worth of violent attacks by individuals that cross borders. And at the same time, self-proclaimed national liberation insurgents are active in Israel and Palestine, in Vietnam, Guatemala, Uruguay, South Africa, and elsewhere. So these national liberation insurgents see themselves as combatants fighting wars of independence. That's why they call themselves national liberation insurgents. And these self-proclaimed insurgents have good reason to believe that their violent struggle could be successful. They have recent examples in the past where violent actors have overthrown existing governments to build their own state. So the example I've already given is Algeria, with Algerian independence from France. We have the Cuban Revolution, where Fidel Castro sets up a new revolutionary government. We also have the ongoing Vietnam War, where the United States just could not seem to prevail against North Vietnam and South Vietnamese guerrillas. And so some of the most extremist of these national liberation actors operate internationally. So prime examples are Palestinians, such as the group Black September Organization, which commits the Munich attack. This group and others seek to bring attention to the Palestinian struggle by committing cross-border attacks. So for example, here you see the remains of Swiss Air Flight 330 from Zurich to Tel Aviv, which was destroyed shortly after takeoff by a bomb on board in early 1970. And so the goal of these Palestinian extremists is to pressure the United States and European states by placing their citizens in immediate danger. Attackers hoped that the US and European countries would want to avert this danger, and that in order to stop these sort of attacks, they would, number one, stop supporting opponents of their national liberation struggle. So in this case, the State of Israel. The goal here is to get Americans and Europeans to stop giving support and resources to countries like Israel. In a similar vein, other attackers are trying to stop support to states like South Africa and South Vietnam. So that's the first goal. And the second goal that Palestinian extremists are pursuing here is to be acknowledged as important and relevant political actors. So they want to be treated as state actors, as actors that have a voice in the international community. So these are their goals: threaten citizens of the global north in order to gain recognition from global north states, and to cut off global north support for Israel and the like. However, the US federal government reacts differently. So President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger are determined not to acknowledge Palestinians as political actors, or to give them a voice on issues such as the Arab-Israeli conflict. So Nixon and Kissinger are determined to negotiate only with state officials and not with what they see as non-state actors. So some of the attacks that are committed by Palestinians are huge, like the Dawson's Field hijackings. So Nixon and Kissinger have to get involved in those. But a lot of other attacks do not reach these spectacular levels. And so most of these Palestinian attacks and similar attacks are handled at the middling levels of the US State Department. And desk officials there have to figure out how to prevent and handle these violent attacks in ways that will not interfere with Nixon and Kissinger's sort of high-level diplomatic initiatives. So things like the Middle East peace process. And the desk officers also have to figure out how to do it in ways that will avoid deploying the US military. The use of the military could create Cold War tensions, particularly in the Middle East, with the Soviet Union and Soviet allied states. And any use of the military on the part of the United States is also going to be playing into Palestinian extremist claims to be revolutionaries. So what the US State Department does is start negotiating these extradition agreements. They're multilateral agreements, so binding many states at once. The idea is to stop other states from politically supporting attackers and to get all states to arrest, prosecute, and extradite attackers. Because once again, only criminals are extraditable. These agreements would, the State Department hope, cut off safe havens for attackers and deter future attacks without any use of the military. So the State Department at this point in 1972 has already had some success and has already negotiated a couple of these agreements. So in 1970 and 1971, US officials negotiated 3 multilateral extradition agreements in smaller technical organizations. 2 of these agreements are against hijacking, so they cover hijacking and they cover attacks on airports in an organization called the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a UN branch responsible for aviation. And there's one agreement that covers attacks on diplomats in the Regional Organization of American States. So the idea is that if you commit this type of attack, you are extraditable. And the idea is to get as many states as possible to sign on to these agreements so that you know that wherever you go in the world, if you commit such an attack, you can then be extradited. These conventions have a lot of loopholes. They're leaky like a sieve. There's still some protections for political actors in there, but they do set precedents and norms. And in 1971, the State Department officials had also introduced the draft of a similar agreement against attacks on diplomats to be taken up by the United Nations General Assembly. So they were trying to move into the United Nations with this. So by 1972, the United States had worked in the international community of states to address hijacking, attacks on airports, and attacks on diplomats, primarily as criminal and law enforcement issues and not as military, national liberation, or self-determination problems. So it is at this moment that the attack at the Munich Olympic Games happens. The date of the attack is September 5th and 6th, 1972. So what happens is during the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich, 8 members of the Palestinian Black September organization sneak into the quarters of the Israeli athletic team in the Olympic Games compound. They kill 2 people and they take 9 athletes and trainers hostage. And this is a media spectacle, and I mean spectacle in the very literal sense of the word. The media get very close to the attackers and the hostages, as seen by these photos of the building that the attackers and hostages are in. So one of the attackers is actually visible also on the far right. The attackers attempt to leave the country. Local Bavarian law enforcement mounts a last-minute rescue, but Bavarian law enforcement is poorly prepared. They have no training or experience in this type of situation, and all hostages die in the rescue attempt. The attack is reported on in media throughout the world with a really high level of coverage. Arab leaders condemn the attack and say that it is unacceptable, but they also use the event to draw attention to the context of the Palestinian national liberation struggle. Meanwhile, in the United States and Europe, the mainstream media portrays this type of violence as something new. So the direct threat to civilians at home in the global north is new. So before 1972, you have a lot of different terms that are being used for this type of attack and this type of attacker. You have words like guerrillas, anarchists, bandits, thugs, fighters, revolutionaries, and terrorists. And what we see crystallizing after the Munich attack is that media and government officials adopt the term international terrorism to describe these attacks. So they adopt a term that had been previously associated with insurgency and colonial contexts, but they're now using it to just describe the attack itself. So you see in 1972, the term terrorism begins appearing a lot more in media around the world. You can trace it on newspaper indexes. If you're doing archival research, 1972 is the moment that you're going to see files labeled as international terrorism files. And so the Munich attack is really a watershed event in the history of terrorism because the term terrorism and the fear of attacks in the US and Europe spreads widely in the aftermath of the attack. Immediately after the attack, the targeted states do take steps to protect themselves. Israel has been engaging in military, intelligence, and counterinsurgency measures against Palestinian attackers, as well as in military deterrence operations against its neighboring states. And the Israeli government continues these practices with attacks on Palestinian targets in Lebanon in the immediate aftermath of the Munich attack. The Israeli government also begins a covert operation to find and assassinate the responsible Palestinians. In West Germany, where the attack took place, the cabinet introduces new immigration restrictions for citizens of Arab states and also creates a new tactical unit to deploy in future attacks because the rescue at Munich failed so horribly. In the United States, Richard Nixon also reacts. He wanted to assuage voters in the upcoming presidential elections, which were only 2 months away. He wanted to stop Israel from responding in a way that would undermine US detente and Middle East policies, and Nixon was also genuinely fearful that the United States would be the next target. So he creates a new working committee against terrorism. He employs the surveillance program Operation Boulder, and Nixon decides that he wants the United States to push for a multilateral extradition agreement against international terrorism, just like the agreements that the United States has already negotiated against hijackings and against attacks on diplomats. So Nixon wants an agreement that will require all signatory states to treat international terrorists as criminals and to arrest, prosecute, and extradite them. And Nixon wants it in the biggest possible global venue, the United Nations. I should add that Nixon doesn't really think the US will actually be able to achieve such an agreement. The United States has already faced a lot of opposition from the Global South in the United Nations, especially in the General Assembly during his time in office. So the Global South is really challenging the primacy of the United States and other Global North countries to shape policy in the United Nations. So we have a White House tape where Nixon and Henry Kissinger are very clear about this fact. But Nixon thinks that such an agreement, such a convention, will be a good way for the US to demonstrate that it is doing something against international terrorism. And so the US State Department introduces the idea of an anti-terrorist extradition agreement in the United Nations General Assembly on September 26, 1972, which is 3 weeks after the Munich attack. Leading the initiative is Nixon's United Nations ambassador and later CIA director, Vice President, and President George H.W. Bush. The General Assembly at this moment has 132 member states. And a problem, as I've mentioned, is that the Global South, recently independent countries, as well as non-aligned states, are a really powerful group at this moment in the General Assembly. And they have a track record of defending the interests of national liberation movements and self-determination actors. So they are going to want to, in this context, talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict. So why does the US State Department choose the General Assembly and not the Security Council? The Soviet Union has in fact signaled that it would make any discussion about international terrorism in the Security Council a discussion about the Middle East peace process and the military situation in the region. And these are issues that Nixon and Kissinger do not want to link to international terrorism. So they would rather deal with the General Assembly than face the Soviets in the Security Council. Terrorism for Nixon is overall still a second-tier issue. He does not want these discussions to disrupt his grand policy initiatives like detente and the Middle East peace process, which the US is hopefully going to control. So US official strategy in the General Assembly is going to be to build a large enough coalition with European countries, with industrialized states such as Japan and Australia, and with conservative Latin American states in support of a crime and extradition-focused agreement. So the debate on international terrorism takes place in the General Assembly from November 9th to 27th, 1972, and it is held in the General Assembly's 6th committee, which is the Committee on Legal Matters. So the location itself showcases that for the US and its allies, this is a crime and legal problem. They want to discuss the terrorism item as a technical extradition matter. Bush specifically does not want this matter to go to committees that have to do with warfare or with national liberation or decolonization. So the United States and European countries and their Latin American allies present their position. The position being that international terrorists are criminals, that they commit brutal violence, that this is an immediate threat to people around the world, and that states need to commit to practical, quickly implemented countermeasures, and an extradition agreement is a way to get such a practical and quick countermeasure. The opposite position is led by the longtime Saudi UN ambassador, Jamil Murad Baroudi, and it is held by most Arab states, most African states, and states active in communist and non-aligned politics, such as Yugoslavia and Cuba. And these delegates take a different position. They acknowledge that acts of terrorism break criminal laws and that violence against civilians is wrong and should be condemned. But they argue that overall, insurgents have a general right to commit violence in pursuit of political aims. So these delegates do not want any extradition agreement against terrorism along the lines that Bush and the American delegation is proposing. They are instead interested in using the issue of terrorism to further debate about imperialism, about national liberation, and anti-colonial warfare. And these are links that the US does not want drawn. Arab, African, and other states also point out that countries such as the United States and Israel have been using their militaries to suppress insurgent uprisings in places like Palestine and Vietnam. So the delegates of such states in the UN are arguing that the US and its allies had engaged in violence and anti-colonial conflict in the global south in the first place, and that the US and its allies are now facing the repercussions of irregular warfare that they had willingly engaged in. Only now these repercussions are happening in a different place, in global North territories, in these colonizer states themselves. I should mention that Israel is an outlier to the US position in this debate, which is really focused on extradition. The Israeli UN ambassador Yosef Tekoa argues that international terrorism should be addressed with military countermeasures. And after it becomes clear that US officials will not embrace Israeli views in the General Assembly, the Israeli government works with US officials for over a decade to address international terrorism through militarized means. And this happens more behind closed doors and is eventually successful in the 1980s. So overall, the Arab, African, and their allied argument is that state oppression fosters anti-colonial national liberation resistance. Terrorism is an offshoot and a regrettable repercussion of this irregular warfare. While the US and European and their allied position is that terrorism is committed by non-state actors who are breaking the law, and that is their defining feature and nothing else. And yet overall, the Arab and African interpretation is the one that the Sixth Committee and the General Assembly adopts with a majority on December 18, 1972. And this becomes Resolution 3034, Measures to Prevent International Terrorism. So some of the key sections of this resolution are that the General Assembly reaffirms the inalienable right to self-determination and independence of all peoples under colonial and racist regimes. So it's pointing to places like the US and Israel, and other forms of alien domination. And the General Assembly upholds the legitimacy of their struggle, in particular the struggle of national liberation movements, in accordance with the purposes and principles of the Charter and relevant resolutions of the organs of the United Nations. The General Assembly condemns the continuation of repressive and terrorist acts by colonial, racist, and alien regimes in denying people their legitimate right to self-determination and independence and other human rights and fundamental freedoms. So again, we have this turnaround that it's the colonizing states that are the terrorists in this instance. And the General Assembly invites states to take all appropriate measures at the national level with a view to the speedy and final elimination of the problem, bearing in mind these sort of provisions above. So the result is that the General Assembly has, at least in 1972, as a reaction to the Munich attack, decided that the terrorism debate is really about national liberation movements, it's about irregular warfare, it's about the wars of national liberation. And the only way to prevent these terrorist attacks is to address the underlying political issues. So what remains of the US interpretation of international terrorism? the idea that terrorism is a criminal individual attack. The US does not drop it, and this view continues to shape and drive subsequent anti-terrorism initiatives in the United States and in Europe. So, for example, the United States is able to negotiate a General Assembly agreement against attacks on diplomats. The agreement is the one that it had been working on since 1971. This agreement covers a narrower issue. Instead of focusing on terrorism, it focuses on attacks on diplomats. And it again specifies that states should either prosecute those who attack diplomats or extradite those people elsewhere for prosecution. So the legal principle of to extradite or to prosecute. States are already required to protect diplomats under international law. So what European countries and the US argue is that this agreement is just reinforcing protections that are already in place. And US officials also use a state building argument. Many of these new members of the General Assembly are very young states, and US and European officials argue that states could demonstrate their sovereignty and their control over violence on their territory and their ability to conduct international relations by making sure that they protected diplomats on the territory and by signing this type of agreement. An attack on diplomats in Khartoum, Sudan in March 1973 amplifies the US position. This is again an attack by the Black September Organization. So members of the Black September Organization force their way into a reception at the Saudi embassy in Khartoum. They take all foreign diplomats present as hostages. And when Nixon publicly announces that he will not negotiate with the attackers shoot and kill 2 American diplomats and a Belgian diplomat. And so overall, these points, the fact that this attack happened and the idea that this is a narrower agreement allows a lot of states to sign on to this agreement. So in December 1973, the General Assembly adopts the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes against Internationally Protected Persons, including diplomatic agents. So the US is able to pass the crime and extradition-focused convention at the United Nations. And we see further agreements follow in the mid to late 1970s. The West Germans are really the key drivers of these later agreements. So coming from the weeds back to the big picture, in the 1970s, violent extremists increasingly targeted the global north with cross-border attacks, and they oftentimes framed their actions as anti-colonial in purpose. In collaborative responses, the United States and its European allies sought international law, extradition, and crime-focused solutions. These steps ignored attackers' anti-colonial and national liberation claims by highlighting the sheer brutality of the violence and the ways in which these acts violated domestic criminal laws. So I study how the US and European states collaborated against international terrorism. Domestic anti-terrorism initiatives stopped at national borders. So Global North officials collaborated to pass extradition agreements that would criminalize attackers around the world, cut off their safe havens, and ensure their criminal prosecution. And Global North officials did this by seeking shared rules and processes within international law that all states would use, even the Global South states that the attackers most often came from and sought refuge in. In this collaboration, Global North officials articulated a common understanding of terrorists as illegitimate and individual actors, primarily as criminals, instead of as guerrillas, insurgents, rational actors, or political agents. There wasn't any buy-in from the entire global community. As I have shown, this was a heavily controversial idea. This was a Western normative understanding. But state officials and the publics in the global north focused more and more on the fact that these actors were criminals who broke the law, hurt innocents, and created an ominous new security threat in homes previously untouched by decolonizing violence. And this approach was really specific to the 1970s, to the era of multilateralism, interdependence, globalization, and law and order initiatives. So globalization and the spreading aviation industry facilitated travel, and this included travel by violent non-state actors. Meanwhile, on the international diplomatic stage, Western states collaborated against the rising number of recently independent states and against the assertive demands that young states made, especially regarding decolonization. And so overall, Western states also are using this to police violent actors who cross national borders, literally police them, while they protect the domestic and internal security of their states. So overall, what global North states are doing is utilizing anti-terrorism agreements during the 1970s as a means to retrench their authority in response to the upheaving processes of decolonization and globalization. Through anti-terrorism agreements and regulations, global North states sought to control international norms, exclude non-state actors from politics, and dictate terms to new states with revolutionary foreign policy agendas that threatened to upset the global status quo. By the early 1980s, however, global North states found that their crime-focused collaboration and extradition-based measures took a lot of time, they were limited and contentious in scope. And so in the 1980s, we see global North states turning more to intelligence services and military units, such as special forces, for faster results. Yet the 1970s conceptions of terrorism, international terrorism, remained as well. Contemporaries focused on the criminal aspects of attacks and downplayed local political contexts. And both of these, this criminalized view and militarized practices, would later feed into the global war on terror. So overall, since the 1970s, international collaboration in counterterrorism has included crime-focused international law approaches on the one hand, and militarized practices that offer faster, more direct, and more controllable results for policymakers on the other hand. International terrorism is today a crime punished through military means. And this book covers a very specific historical moment in the 1970s when state officials emphasized international law and, in particular, extradition agreements as key anti-terrorism steps and introduced them as standard anti-terrorism practices. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.